Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counselor of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As usual, thank you to everybody who makes this work possible. In today's episode, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Hodges, all the way from Texas, who's going to be talking with us, and we're going to be having a deep discussion about disability, perceptions about disability, and the socially constructed nature of how people perceive disability. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everybody that what you find on the internet or in the media is not advice. If you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. If you're in Australia and seeking mental health support, counselling, then my contact details, if you're looking to find me, are in the description of this episode. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's my pleasure. Dan, tell us about yourself and what you do.
For context, I was born blind and I also have a connective tissue disorder. So I've spent all of my adult life and a good chunk of my childhood in some level of chronic pain, frequent injuries. I have some mental health experience as well. So, I leveraged all of that experience to eventually go to law school and created a nonprofit with my cousin while I was in law school, which is dedicated toward erasing the stigma surrounding disability and chronic illness, essentially so that we can create opportunities for others that we did not enjoy ourselves.
Stigma is very much a socially constructed phenomenon in the sense that a lot of issues don't have inherent qualities unless someone assigns them in their own mind and then spreads those ideas to other people. And the stigma around disability is very much socially constructed and has nothing to do with the disabled individual themselves, but rather the ideas that other people have about them. So this is something that I'm constantly encouraging people to do, to think about whether ideas are inherent or objective, or whether we are inventing them and then using them in ways that may or may not be helpful. Where do you think we should start on this topic?
So I'll unpack it by giving you a recent example of something I wrote, which is we talk about, let's say, blindness as, the loss of vision, of course, and we prescribe different struggles to vision loss. But when I was writing a post for my organization for International Braille Day, I talked about how Braille is not ubiquitous. So as blind people, we navigate a world where most of the signage that people with sight rely upon is not available to us. So street signs, addresses, price tags in the store, so many other things. And then as we're using our alternative techniques to gain access to the information we need to live independently, of course that looks differently than someone who's using their sight to access that information. And thus people become confused about, well, are they struggling? Do they need help? This must be so awful to have to navigate the world this way. And in reality, it's not a byproduct of vision loss. It's not a byproduct of having a more difficult, or not really having a more difficult life. It's a design choice. It's a choice that we have made as a society to prioritize print signage while making other forms of information much more limited in scope. And I think as we think about that as just one example, we start to unpack how disability, and especially accessibility, is a social idea. It's something that is certainly a real difference, but the scope of impact is by and large a choice that we have made as a society.
Would you suggest that there's no inherent reason why there can't be more accessible forms of communication, not just for the blind, but for people with other communication difficulties as well, that are different to what we consider socially normal, but at the same time would be useful to the groups of people for whom that form of communication doesn't work? Do you believe that it would be easier than we think it is to actually integrate that into society and make it a working part of the social landscape?
Absolutely. And there's a tremendous amount of research out there that shows that these investments actually pay for themselves over time, both in the private sector and in the public sector as well. So, when you increase access to information and opportunity, what you're doing is you're increasing the likelihood that people are going to be able to go out and earn a living and create something of value for themselves and others. And so not only can we do this, we absolutely should do this.
You've made reference to another important socially constructed idea there, which is the idea that when somebody is using any type of social assistance, that they must be doing so willfully. And that is a ridiculous assumption, but a lot of people hold it in their minds because of, I would say most likely because of egocentric bias, in the sense that it's difficult for any person to understand a worldview other than their own. They can take steps to do so, but often it is a human default based on our evolutionary past to assume that our worldview is the one on which we should focus. But when you shift that and understand other people's perspectives, you quickly learn that people are often using social assistance out of necessity. And so, what people I think will discover more that they may not assume to be the case is that if you were to speak to people who use forms of social assistance, you would actually learn what they want is mostly what all of us want: to be independent, to have access to the things that they enjoy in life, to be able to work, to be able to spend time with the people it's important to them. And all these forms of social assistance actually facilitate that in a way that a lot of people would take for granted.
Totally. And if you believe, as I do, that every human is endowed with a unique blend of talents and gifts, and that part of that endowment involves a desire to exercise, utilize, expand those gifts and talents, then it really makes sense to think that relying on some sort of government assistance, particularly in the long term, really is not part of how we're wired. And so we can then start to look at the social dynamics that contribute to particularly long-term use, whether it be forms of bias or discrimination, or even the fact that hope in itself is fickle. And so looking at how we cultivate hope, that idea that even if you acquire a disability later in life, you could still contribute, you could still be part of something meaningful, that starts to shift the paradigm so that we're able to get people back out into the world living out their potential.
Absolutely. It is absolutely a part of the human desire to self-actualize, to try to better oneself through activity. Not all of our tendencies aid it, but we do have both the potential and the capacity. And it's also important to note that the perception of people relying too heavily on government assistance is a complicated one because, yes, there are people who do that for reasons that aren't necessarily healthy, and some people do exploit the system. In any system, there are going to be people who exploit it. But the reason that people assume that that's the majority, I think, is because we tend to be attracted to what's emotionally charged. And when we become aware of instances of exploitation of the system through the media, social media, the legacy media, we tend to remember that because it makes us angry, but we forget that those are only very specific examples. We don't account for all the people out there who would like to not be using government assistance, but don't have much of a choice within the realms of what's reasonable because they're trying to survive in light of limitations. And that if there were better forms of assistance, like, for example, better access to care in the workplace or better access to care in the community, then they would most likely want to rely less on assistance and be more independent. So we have to remember that instances of exploitation or instances of unhealthy reliance, they may be too frequent, but whether or not they're widespread is not an easy judgment to make, because in order to say that it's the majority, you would first have to have a clear definition of what is unhealthy use of assistance. And then that's not something you can measure in numbers. You have to measure it qualitatively.
Exactly. And how does one quantify or measure how difficult it is to apply for job after job and be turned away because you don't fit the idea of what an employer has envisioned regarding what they think their model employee looks like? Maybe you're using assistive technology to perform a task instead of a keyboard and mouse and reading a computer screen. Or maybe you're maneuvering in a wheelchair instead of walking, or maybe you're dealing with chronic pain or mental health concerns and you're having a flexible schedule, but still getting the job done as effectively, if not more effectively, than your peers. How, the first time that happens, you bounce back. The second time, it's a little harder. The fifth, the 10th, the 20th, the 50th. How hard is it in numbers to bounce back from that? And I think that is a conversation we need to have, both because it's sobering, and also because it helps us calibrate the conversation to a place where we can say, wait a minute, this is something we can control. If we can create opportunities for people to prove themselves, and if we can create access in a way that prevents barriers from getting in the way, that's the best plan we have for getting people off of government assistance.
Going to the root of the perception of disability and the socially constructed nature of it. In sociology, a systemic problem is considered to be one that doesn't evolve from nature. It doesn't evolve from an event that happens on its own. It evolves because people distort reality. An example of this in the realms of disability would be that if a person has a disability, they cannot perform any job. Now, that's not inherently true. There are plenty of people with disabilities that can perform jobs and so many other different roles in society. The theory around systemic issues is that they start from a misconception, but then they get exaggerated, and they often get exaggerated on purpose. We theorize that certain individuals are socially considered, they're not literally, they don't literally exist this way in nature, but they are socially considered to have certain qualities, not because they do have those qualities, but because society functions by a small number of people that are extremely powerful and wealthy, perpetuating these ideas so that the majority of people will continue to be essentially unarmed, helpless, and ignorant. And they will continue to foster and follow these beliefs so that they remain ignorant of the truth, and the people at the top of society remain powerful and rich, and they continue to prosper in their privilege. And in the realms of disability, if we continue to perpetuate the idea that a person with a disability cannot work at all and cannot have any kind of role in society or any kind of independence, many people do hold it unintentionally because they've been taught it. But the theory is, from a systemic standpoint, that these ideas were originally at the heart of humanity, however many hundreds of years ago that was, that these ideas were initiated deliberately because if we keep certain vulnerable groups disadvantaged, it allows other groups to maintain advantage.
A lot of this is a failure of creativity. You have a privileged group who has the ability to access the world in a certain way, and thus they were able to construct different systems in such a manner that it was most convenient for them very narrowly, and not as convenient for the broader masses. And to be sure, people with disabilities often operate on the fringes of access. We maybe inhabit a more extreme segment of society as far as how we integrate with the world. And I think that's where this comes into play. We adapt, we make the world as best we can, but with the continuing evolution of how the world progresses with different structures digitally, physically, etc., that lack of forethought really continues to marginalize people. I tell people that with blindness, for instance, 30% of the struggles I have on a daily basis are intrinsic to vision loss. That's a real thing. But 70% are societal or structural in nature. Real difficulties that come from having very limited vision. There are very real difficulties that come from having chronic pain. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, waking up with an elbow that's not quite properly in joint, or having to worry about hands that get inflamed when I type. I'm not going to try to tell you that those aren't real problems, but I think the broader point is when we control what's controllable, when we design things that bring the best out of every human, including those with disabilities, we shift from a scarcity to an abundance point of view, and we're able to tackle larger problems, including those that are systemic. We saw a lot of this during the COVID pandemic. Disability advocates have been advocating for years for telework options, and during the pandemic, it became a necessity. And what happened is you ended up seeing the beauty of universal design, where in a lot of settings, productivity went up, job satisfaction went up, and companies adapted because it was more readily beneficial to the masses. And I think when we focus on things like that, it brings our conversation to a more positive place. Ableism, which is the pervasive belief that people with certain abilities are more valuable to society than people with other beliefs. So basically, our version of racism or sexism, it's a real thing. And there have been some awful, awful instances of where that has gone to severe extremes. People don't know typically that before Hitler came for the Jews, before Hitler came for the gays, before Hitler came for the gypsies, the first people in concentration camps were those who were deemed unworthy to live, a la people with disabilities. And in the US, before concentration camps were a thing, there was already a strong eugenics movement that had made forced sterilization and other awful things within a medical setting not only socially acceptable, but promoted by the supposed elites. That's a thing. And it's a thing that's not really talked about in the US. I don't know about in Australia. So I'm not trying to minimize the frankly evil that has existed or the ways that people with disability have been mistreated. I mean, when my ex-wife and I had our first kid, we had Child Protective Services beat us home from the hospital simply because we were blind parents, even though we had checked every box for being able to parent our kids adequately. We had met every expectation objectively, and yet their bias was so strong that they just couldn't wrap their heads around blind parents being successful. That's a thing. But the other side of this is most people, I'm assuming especially the people who are listening to this podcast, they're not out there thinking to themselves, gee, how can we eradicate people with disabilities? They're trying to sort out what we're saying versus the harmful messages that they've been exposed to all their lives that that basically feed into this idea that helping people with disabilities is noble, if not necessarily efficient. And I think that's where I want to push, where I try to push conversations with my organization to say, look, if you're curious, if you're willing to revisit your assumptions, I'm not gonna lump you in with Hitler. I'm gonna say, welcome to our side of the movement. Let's meet you where we are and help you move forward.
Thank you for that insight, Daniel. And I have to say, I'm sorry to hear that you were treated so poorly by the law. That's absolutely horrendous. And I want to remind people, even in Australia, which we assume is a relatively progressive society, there have been reports in the news of autistic children being physically restrained when it wasn't absolutely necessary, being locked in boxes. I think it's been the case in other countries as well. There have been people who have gone to the media and revealed this about their own workplaces because they saw disabled people being abused. In Australia, we have the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS. And so often in the media and on social media and in my interactions with people, there have been stories arising of people being abused by private providers and there is too little oversight to effectively address it. So even if society at large doesn't advocate for abuse, it still happens, and it still happens because we allow it to happen. So there are solutions to these problems, but we have effectively ignored them, I dare say. And there is absolutely no excuse for that. Running a society in which we don't abuse the vulnerable may be difficult, but it's not impossible. There are a number of complexities in how we conceptualize ableism that need to be addressed. I'm genuinely interested in knowing all the facets of an issue. I've discussed the issue of systemic bias before, and we know that it exists, and we know that people do make incorrect assumptions about individuals who are part of minority groups, who are part of vulnerable groups. What about the instances in which there may be reasons beyond convenience or beyond ableism why certain forms of access aren't available? A good example of this, perhaps it's a bit too specific or a bit too reductionist, but it helps to start the conversation. How about instances in which we are looking at, for example, a small business that doesn't have wheelchair access? Now, the business themselves may not have anything against people in wheelchairs or with other disabilities accessing their business, and they would be more than willing to serve them. But the issue is that the installation of that access is going to cost them money. And so we say, okay, well, if you can't afford that, then we'll institute a social program to pay for it. But then the problem is that governments, and I have no problem in saying this, people who seek power don't really have organized minds. Like governments never do things in an organized fashion, unfortunately. That occasionally they might, but all too often they complicate things to the extent that they become too cumbersome to actually achieve the desired outcome. So we may institute a social program to pay to provide subsidies to small businesses so that they can install wheelchair access. But then politicians and bureaucrats in their infinite wisdom decide there has to be all this compliance work to do as well. And the idea of that compliance work is never done by a person with a disability. It's never done by a professional construction worker or an occupational therapist or somebody who actually has the requisite knowledge to know what is safe and what is unsafe. It's done by a bureaucrat. And then that costs money and time, which slows the process. And every cent you spend affects the economy in some way. So it's not as if we can just print more money. If you charge for, if something costs money, then it's going to affect the economics of the whole scheme. Often that'll involve also engaging private providers to contract to the government to undertake the work. And if those providers are forced to do all this extra work, they're going to charge for it, which means that it costs more, which means that it slows the process, it makes it less efficient. The government runs out of money. They say, oops, we didn't realize we didn't budget correctly. Therefore, we're going to have to either close the scheme or reduce how much we subsidize or limit who we can subsidize, which means that not everyone gets it. And the businesses that are trying to get it still only get subsidized partially. They have to pay for the rest. So some businesses decide, oh, you know what, I just won't do it at all, which leads to further disadvantage. Someone always has to come along and complicate it to the extent that the actual people who would benefit from it, number one, never would have suggested, and number two, ultimately don't get to benefit from it because someone who has absolutely no experience or knowledge of the situation has come up with some bizarre idea that why don't we do this just because it makes it better, but it actually doesn't. And then there's complication, and then what have we achieved? Nowhere near as much as we could have. The question is always, well, what if you just think logically, get rid of all the bureaucracy, but then who actually does that? Who takes responsibility for actually changing the system so that it does what it's meant to do?
Yeah, and something that we have done with my organization that I hope catches on is we talk about the idea of lived experience. You were just mentioning a minute ago, not having people with disabilities involved in the process of creating access, which is certainly half the problem when it comes to ineffective solutions. But the other thing that we talk about is also the process of creating accessibility has to involve every stakeholder. So if I, as an accessibility advocate, go to a small business, I may know what I need to access their business within certain parameters, but I don't have a firsthand knowledge of what it means to run a, let's say, restaurant on super spend margins with a million things coming at you every day. I don't know what that's like. And so oftentimes you end up with parties that are talking past each other instead of talking to each other. So something I'm working on through my organization and hoping again, I hope people steal my idea and make it even better is I really try to sit down with business owners and say, look, if you're willing to have this chat with me, I'm already assuming good intent. I know your heart's in the right place. Don't worry about that. Tell me where your pain points are from your point of view. And then let me sprinkle in a few additional nuggets from my side of the fence. Let's make sure everybody feels heard and understood. And then from that point, we can put our heads together and figure out how we can collaboratively solve this problem.
Absolutely. And it's my understanding, and I imagine you've either seen instances of this or had experiences yourself of what we might call people with a savior complex, claiming to know what individuals in a vulnerable community, such as the disabled community, might need, and then announcing this is what we're going to do. And then someone such as yourself with actual lived experiences, hang on a minute, that's not what I need,
Yep.
nor what I would have asked for. Why didn't anyone consult me on this?
Yeah, and then yeah, and again, on the other side of the fence, you have business owners that are being vilified, saying, "Wait a minute, we're not trying to be ableist, but we're trying to run a business too, or we're trying to run a school, or we're trying to run a medical facility." And so you have these disjointed points that somebody has to sit down and form a triangle with. You do need, funding, whether it be from nonprofits or from government or somebody to actually pay the price to get these investments started, because the business case pays for itself, but it takes time. You do need stakeholders at the table who are looking for help. And you do need disability advocates and engineers on the other side who say, okay, this is the range of options we're aware of. How do we properly assemble these components? And it's going to take all three, creating that virtuous triangle in order to make this real change. One of the things that's happened, I've observed, is people will, out of what we'll call it misplaced empathy, people will try to put themselves in my shoes or your shoes or somebody else's shoes and say, well, this is what it must be like to be blind or live in chronic pain or have a mental illness or whatever the case may be. And that is oftentimes, it's a laudable thing. It's a laudable goal, but it's not effective, because when people try that tact, they end up misunderstanding what life is actually like, but they don't have the context, they don't have the training, they don't have the tools that we have developed over time. And so stigma actually increases with that kind of empathy, because people walk away from that experience being afraid and being even more convinced of how awful disability must be in their own mind. So it actually brings people backwards. So I think that, again, this is why understanding things from a variety of points of view is so critical.
Absolutely. It's particularly important that you drew attention to the fact that often people have the right intentions, but they have completely unintended and completely ineffective consequences. Ergo, the old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There's a difference between being nice and being righteous. And what being nice often means to simply be pleasant, because in your own mind and your own emotional experience, it avoids discomfort and creates what you believe to be pleasure for yourself and what you imagine of those around you. And so a person who's trying to be nice might say, oh, you poor thing, life must be so hard for you. Whereas being righteous means actually being conscientious and considering the consequences of what you do and paying attention to the details and saying, I imagine there are some difficulties involved. Can you tell me what they are? And we'll do what we can to help develop some ways to address those difficulties. As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Kay Crow of the Love Life Counsellor. Kay Crow provides online relationship counselling across Australia for singles, individuals and couples wanting to overcome barriers to connection, resolve conflict, repair attachment and build healthy relationships. With 8 years' worth of experience in mental health, Kay has seen how relationship difficulties can impact well-being. She helps clients explore patterns, attachment styles and emotional habits to create meaningful, fulfilling connections through a nurturing and inclusive approach. Find the Love Life Counsellor at www.thelovelifecounsellor.com.au. I'd like to address some of the politics involved in this because, again, there is a lot of misconception, there's a lot of ineffective conceptualization, and there's a lot of, I think, deliberate misguidance in political spheres, and it really does work against people who are at a disadvantage. All too often, when we consider systemic issues, we associate that with what is traditionally progressive or left-wing politics, which politics, whether we like it or not, is largely socially constructed. Nature didn't put us on Earth to be parts of political cohorts. We invented that ourselves. So we define these ideas according to what's in our minds, not based on what they actually are. So I don't like to use these terms to pigeonhole people, but more to just refer to how people tend to think about them in their minds. So it tends to be associated with left-wing or progressive politics to consider that disability is a socially constructed or systemic issue to a large part. And it tends to be considered a conservative standpoint to say that we also need to consider the impacts of social programs on the people who have to pay for them, but don't necessarily benefit from them. When we talk about societal oppression, when we talk about the fact that powerful people or the elites of society long ago spread ideas that we then adopted and knew no better than to believe, which then kept us living in ways that kept some people disadvantaged and others advantaged. The way that people conceptualize it often isn't effective. It often facilitates a phenomenon known as learned helplessness, by which if we believe that there's no point in us trying, then our minds then focus only on the possibility of failure and ignore all the information that suggests that there are things that we can do to succeed. But there is oppression in the theory of oppression itself. Mm-hmm. Because what often happens is when the theory of oppression becomes widespread, as it often is in communities or societies in which progressive ideals or supposedly progressive ideals are considered mainstream, what then happens is every person is taught you're a victim. And when they're taught they're a victim, they don't consider all the information that suggests that they may actually be able to break any potential victimhood that they have. And so when they learn not to do that, and they learn to blame society, which is quite an abstract phenomenon because it's hard to define exactly who. People don't tend to actually define who is in society. They just say society, but they don't think of, well, what does society consist of and who are the different institutions and people within it. When they learn that, it actually prevents them from taking action that could well be beneficial to them. But then there's another layer to that. That creates a stereotype of people in vulnerable communities. And people who are more conservative stereotypically they look at people who are in vulnerable communities, they say, oh, they're just playing victim. They're just people who want a handout. They're just people who want other people's pity. All they say is society oppresses them. And here's the problem. There are people who do play victim, and there are people who do not realize that they have learned helplessness. But for many of them, it's not their fault because they don't realize that these ideas are actually harming them. And at the same time, there are plenty of people such as yourselves who are looking for a way to minimize victimization. But the media constantly perpetuates the stereotype of people in vulnerable communities by always presenting the examples of people who perpetuate victimhood. And when you see, politicians at a press conference, the people that they choose to represent those communities are always people who fit the stereotypes. And the question we have to ask is, when all these companies that provide disability services and all these politicians and media outlets are always presenting the issue from the perspective of someone who fits the stereotype and perhaps has an unhealthy view of the situation, how likely is it that it's actually distorting our views of the majority of people in that community, by which most of them don't want to be victims of it all? They're trying to find their way into independence, but the situation just doesn't allow for it. And every time they say to a politician, hypothetically, or a government agency or some big organization, hey, listen, that's not what I asked for, and what this person is saying doesn't represent me. I don't need that at all. I need this. And they just said, yeah, yeah, whatever. You're not a politician. You're not a CEO. You're not somebody in a higher position, or you're not someone with a PhD. What does your opinion matter? Ultimately, what we're doing is oppressing ourselves, not by deliberately trying to rob society, but by choosing only people who have an unhealthy view of the matter to push the ideas that influence government policy and organizational policies. And the people who are on the ground, the majority of people in those communities, be it the disabled community, the mentally ill community, the gay community, the trans community, communities of all different sorts, how often are they actually consulted? How often is the average viewpoint actually consulted? I think that we hardly consult that moderate viewpoint. We only consult the most extreme viewpoints, and I think it's for political reasons.
I think what is missing from all of this is nuance. And, in the US, my organization is kind of unique among our peers in that we are intentionally, thoughtfully more moderate in our viewpoint and our messaging than a lot of our contemporaries. We've seen quite the whiplash in the States over the last handful of years, where the previous administration, for reasons that may or may not have been fully genuine, tried to advance certain DEI or DEIA initiatives in a way that wasn't fully in line with what the disabled community truly needed. And then you have the current administration that has torn down everything and then some because it was socially engineered. And I'm not saying I agree with either viewpoint. I'm not gonna take a stand in Biden versus Trump versus anything here. I'm just gonna say you had one side that seems to overestimate the difficulty that we face and underestimate what we're capable of. And you have another side that seems to overestimate the power of certain superhero stories and underestimate the kind of sheer willpower that it takes to get to a certain place. I'm going to give myself again as an example. I mentioned earlier that I started my organization while I was in law school. And what people don't think about or know about in that story a lot of times is how hard it was to get there, not just for reasons of accessibility or other things, but simply because when I was growing up, I actually missed out on 5 full years of my K-12 education. 7th through 11th grade, I just completely missed out on for various reasons. And shortly thereafter, or around the end of that time period, I had a professional sit down with me and then go talk to my parents and say, well, sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Hodges, all he'll ever be able to do is cane chairs. And other professionals in their own way echoed that sentiment throughout the next few years of my life, to where it became a constant barrage of messages. Oh, maybe he'll be able to get his high school equivalent, but he'll never be able to do much in college or hold a real job. And he'll certainly never graduate, or this or that or the other. And I held on to that messaging unconsciously for years before I finally had the right mentors who independently sat me down and said, look, you're articulate, you're a great advocate, you're capable of doing so much more than you currently are. Why wouldn't you consider going to law school? And then came out the excuses. Oh, what about chronic pain? Oh, what about access issues? Oh, what about, not being able to afford it? And the reality was, every one of those things was a legitimate issue. They popped up during my time at law school and then some, but I made it through. Is life difficult with a disability? Yes. Can we succeed? Also, yes. So somewhere between the helpless person and the superhero, there are literally billions of people on this planet with some form of disability who exist in the middle saying, I'm just here doing the best I can, trying to navigate systems that weren't designed with me in mind. And I don't want your pity. I don't want you to turn your back on me. I want you to work with me to make this world a little bit better for everybody.
Thank you for sharing that insight, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And you've spoken to another important aspect of this, and it's how we learn our functioning based on how much faith other people have in us. People underestimate just how important it is. I'm not suggesting that any one allied health practitioner or any one health professional or disability support professional is to blame or is doing this out of malice. But all too often, we don't, as you say, have nuanced thought into considering the phenomenology, that is to say, that subjective experience of every individual with a disability and what that subjective experience means for their reality. Yes, there are some people in the world who can't do certain things. And that is a fact that unfortunately has to be accepted within our current medical technology. Perhaps that will change, and hopefully it does with medical advancements. But I would say this is a systemic issue, but it's a self-destructive systemic issue in the sense that the social theory, the progressive sort of ideology that guides a lot of this, that claims to want to help and destigmatize those with disabilities, is also being self-destructive by internalizing the wrong ideas, because all too often professionals involved in helping those who are at a disadvantage or those who have disabilities or mental illnesses. My theory is, it's hard to discern it in numbers, but my theory is just based on the practices that I've seen. We don't realize sometimes how what we demonstrate to our clients, and me being someone who works with both people with mental illnesses and disabilities, how we demonstrate to our clients our faith in them. I've seen too many instances of people with a victim mindset. I'm not suggesting that they're to blame or that they're doing it deliberately because they want to rule the system. I strongly maintain that they've been misled into believing that that's their reality, that that has to be the reality. But too many people have that victim mindset. And what's possibly perpetuating it is that when they work with their professionals are too afraid to offend them. And so to try to compensate for that, they're not willing to challenge them to think outside the box. And if somebody says, I can't work, then what too many people are afraid to do is say, well, maybe there's another answer to that. Instead of, because they're afraid of, if they say that, then the client might turn around and say, well, you're just denying my victimhood. How dare you stigmatize me? But if you're wise about it, instead of just reacting and saying, oh, well, they say they can't work, I'd better not question it. You have to be willing to ask the philosophical questions. Okay, what does work mean? What does it mean to not be able to do something? Especially with regard to mental illness. This is something that a lot of people just don't explore, and a lot of professionals have trouble understanding it. But they think, if you ask a question, what does it mean not to be able to do something? It sounds really obscure, but it's really important, because you need to understand what is it that's actually stopping someone from taking action. So why can't you work? Because I can't focus, or I can't get through a day. Okay, why can't you get through a day? What happens in the course of a day? When I go through a work day, this happens, and then I have a mental breakdown, and then I can't concentrate. So, okay, what's it like having a mental breakdown? And if you ask those kinds of philosophical questions and you understand the workings of the individual's mind, you can identify what it is about the solutions they've already tried that wasn't working. And then you can propose, okay, if that doesn't work, what if you tried this instead? And if you keep persisting, and every time you make a mistake or have a failure, don't give up and try something different, eventually you may well find a solution that actually does work. And you would have never allowed that person the opportunity to have the dignity of achieving whatever they wanted to achieve in life unless you ask those questions. And all too often we're reactive and go, oh, better not question things, otherwise I might be deemed a bigot. But I think it's equally bigoted to say someone can't do something, therefore I won't bother with them, out of supposed empathy, than it is to say that a person's just playing victim. I think to be truly accepting, you actually have to see a person as a person and say, even though this person has problems, it's actually in their best interest that we explore questions about them, because once we explore those questions, we may discover things that actually result in a healthier, happier life. And that's ultimately what all of us want, isn't it? A healthier, happier life.
It is. And, the mentors who encouraged me to keep leveling up, those mentors, what they had in common is the ability to say, your struggles are real, they're valid, but they're not defining. They don't contain the entire truth of who you are. They focused on intelligence, they focused on work ethic, they focused on passion, they focused on other things that I was able to bring to the table that were not mutated by my disability. And the whole of you is able to achieve greatness if you put your mind to it. Focusing on those struggles does not serve you. And I'm willing to help you believe in yourself and to believe in you while you take that transition. And I think that's what real allyship looks like. I believe praise. I believe words of encouragement. I believe words of solidarity that come from people who are also willing to tell me when I suck at something. Real allyship requires real trust, and it requires real authenticity. So it's not a bad thing to tell somebody when maybe they're on the left side of the bell curve in some particular aspect. We all are. Okay, that's fine. If you balance it out, then you're building that real rapport and that believability, and that's where we need to go.
Absolutely. And what we don't often realize is we learn a lot about ourselves based on what we see in our environment. We internalize ideas based on how often we experience them. It's our mind's way of keeping focus on what is most likely to be true. So if we see people believing in us, over time we're more likely to start believing in ourselves. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this yourself, but I know that people who are in a similar position to you often get attacked by other members of their community saying, you're a sellout, you're just a privileged person, and you're denying the victimhood of us common people who don't have the same privileges that you do. I imagine the response is, hang on a minute, I'm not denying that you have struggles. What I'm saying is, if you only focus on the struggles, you'll never be able to achieve anything that you actually want in life. But if you persist and try things that challenge you, even if they are uncomfortable, then you may come out the other side actually in a life that you do prefer. And which would you rather? To not try at all for the fear of failure and continue to be unhappy and potentially quite oppressed, or persist despite the discomfort and then potentially yield a result that actually is happier and healthier for you?
Yeah, and I've dealt with a little of that, and I know more is coming. We, especially in the US, we talk about intersectionality. And the reality is, yes, I am a straight white male who happens to have multiple disabilities. And I'm not going to say that racism or sexism or anti-LGBTQ bias isn't a powerful force. Of course, that's a powerful force. And of course, there's something to not having experienced that. But I also grew up in poverty. I also grew up in a situation where I have had a lot of things that did not go my way. I have had a number of challenges, a couple of them I mentioned tonight, many others I haven't got to. And so I think that when we look at someone and judge how hard their journey has been based on certain factors without knowing their full story, or heaven forbid, the fact that they're spouting hope when you don't feel hope, it's a real problem. And I hate it that people are feeling that desperate. That's why I do what I do. That's why I went into starting a nonprofit and have done it full time without receiving compensation, instead of sitting for the bar and going off and being a practicing attorney, because I want to create that opportunities for people who have had it better, the same, or worse than I have.
When people talk about intersectionality, it seems to be an overcomplication of the matter in the sense that does you being a heterosexual Caucasian male actually erase the difficulties that would otherwise be directly or indirectly related to your disability? And how do you measure that? For example, if somebody was going to be prejudiced against you if you were applying for a job in which your blindness would not affect your ability to do the job, but they would assume it due to ableism, would the fact that you're a Caucasian heterosexual male all of a sudden make you look more favorable in their eyes? Because I don't know how people could actually measure that notion. It would just be how do we determine that?
Well, it didn't keep the CPS worker or the social worker in Colorado from trying to take my kid. And as you said, it hasn't prevented multiple employers from refusing to hire me for jobs that I was more than adequately qualified for. Now, would I have experienced even more discrimination if I had different characteristics? Maybe. We don't know. But I think your overarching point of it's an oversimplification is true. And again, I'm not trying to minimize racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination, all of which are vile. I'm simply saying we all have our stories. If you're part of any minority group, you know what it's like not to be taken at face value. And maybe it's time for us to link arms and say we're all going to be in this together to try to elevate the potential of every human instead of trying to fight over who's had it worse.
We try to address a problem, but end up becoming a part of it by becoming so angry and resentful of the issue that we react by seeking a target of that anger and resentment and end up enacting the exact aspects of functioning and behaviors that cause the problem against which we're fighting in the first place. There's one more aspect of this discussion on social constructionism and how we perceive disability and other different qualities between people, and it's in the use of language. Now, this is something that I've explored before and plan to explore more, but I am always interested to explore it with somebody who is in the midst of the domain to which the language pertains, because this is a really important point. We say that words have power. It's quite a popular notion in both scientific psychology and popular culture. We say that language influences how we think, and that is in itself true. And we know that, for example, in the fields of persuasion, say in marketing and sales, the way that we use language does influence how people think and the likelihood of them behaving in certain ways. There has arisen a theory over perhaps the last 3 to 4 decades, although it's become more common and more intensified in recent times, that by changing the language that we use to refer to people who are at a disadvantage, we reduce stigma. There are many examples of this. I'll make some of the more common ones salient. Instead of saying disabled person, we say person with a disability. Instead of saying blind person, we say person who has blindness or person who has vision impairment. Instead of saying deaf person, we say person who has hearing impairment. Instead of saying mentally ill individual, we say individual with a mental illness or individual with a mental health condition. Instead of saying depressed person, we say person who is experiencing depression. Instead of saying schizophrenic individual, we say individual who has been told they have schizophrenia. Instead of saying commit suicide, we say person who has ended their life or made an attempt on their life. Now, there are a number of criticisms that I've leveled at this philosophy. One of them is that you can tell a lot about a philosophy by the company that keeps, and it tends to be promoted by people who, I mentioned earlier, tend to be in the upper echelons of society, who run large organizations and government departments and government agencies, who otherwise aren't really acting in the best interests of the communities for whom they claim to stand, which is a separate matter. But then the psychology of it is a bit more complicated than what people make it out to be. The human mind takes in information and then integrates it with existing information, both from memories and from the environment in which it's situated. And so when a person is interpreting information that they're receiving, they're not just interpreting the language someone uses, they're also interpreting other cues like other information that they know about the source of that language and the person and the context and the other cues, for example, non-verbal cues, if non-verbal cues are involved. There is all sorts of contextual information that people at an unconscious level interpret when making a decision at a neurological level about how to interpret or evaluate a situation. Language itself is not the sole determinant of how a person interprets things, but there's also an additional complication, I would argue. If you argue that language itself is enough to create stigma and ableism, you could also argue by the same token that if a person considers a particular word or set of words stigmatizing, it's perhaps because they actually feel uncomfortable with the people in question and they're trying to reduce their own discomfort. And what people seem to have trouble understanding, no matter how much is discussed, is you can actually destigmatize a concept without denying it. So, for example, to call someone disabled, if we believe that that means that we're calling them worthless or we're saying they can't do anything, changing the language itself is not sufficient. We have to change the belief. And just as language can be stigmatizing, we can work to destigmatize it by using direct language in the right context with people where you've already established that you are a trustworthy individual. What you have the great potential to communicate is, I don't see any stigma or problem with you having this disability or you having this problem, and I'm not going to treat you differently based on my assumptions. I'm going to treat you as an individual and ask you what you need and respect you without, letting your problems influence how I respect you. But I do acknowledge that you have those problems. But by changing the language, what you also have the power to do is negate that there is a problem. And again, we see this in the anecdotes that you've described and the other experiences you've described, where people do treat you as if you can't do anything purely based on the fact that you have disabilities. And they may well have been people who wanted to destigmatize the situation by using different language. But what they were actually doing was exposing their own lack of faith in you. And that, I would argue, from a psychological standpoint, is far more ableist and far more stigmatizing than just using certain words. Because if you can stigmatize words, you can destigmatize it. And I would say that if you really care about someone, don't evade reality, but just be willing to acknowledge that the way you see them may be different to how they really are and that your assumptions may be wrong.
Absolutely. So as I was listening to your thoughts on this, I could think of 3 reasons where maybe the language changes are a good thing, and 3 where it's problematic. So for reasons of remembering that people are not defined by their disability, and that's a really good reason why person first language is useful. For reasons of accuracy, for instance, we don't say somebody is wheelchair bound because it's inaccurate. It's not only demeaning, it's inaccurate. People are, by and large, very grateful to have a wheelchair, but they're not bound to it. That's at least what I understand from the wheelchair using community. And then also for for a reason of historicity. We look at some of these ugly words that have been coming back into the public consciousness. It opens up when we have the dialogue around, let's say, the R word, it gives us the chance to say, wait a minute, let us tell you about the events that led to us, really trying to get away from that language. Now, on the other side of the coin, I have noticed in my work with the non-disabled community, the general population, that when conscientiousness around language increases, so does discomfort around speaking with us. People get so guarded about what they can and can't say that they really start to clam. And so that's a bad thing. Another is that it's a distraction, honestly. I'd much rather talk about how we can improve inclusion and access than whether or not a certain particular term is in vogue or should be in vogue. And then finally, on that side, the disability community hasn't done a great job of being uniform. We're a very diverse group of people with a lot of opinions that don't often align. And so even if one wanted to standardize the language, good luck. Now, that being said, the overarching theme there is it's neither good nor bad. It's about how we use it. And are we being strategic? Are we being logical? Are we being thoughtful with how we approach this particular topic?
You've made some excellent arguments there. And in terms of the advantages, you're absolutely right. To expand on it slightly, language is again socially constructed, which means it doesn't mean more than what we actually make it mean. So if we have injected stigma into language, then that is a human manufactured problem. If we are to say that language isn't important, that's a reductionist and rather extreme argument. If we were to make that argument, then we could basically say, well, you can swear in the workplace all you want to your clients and to your colleagues. It doesn't matter. Politeness is just socially constructed. We need those norms because it helps keep us orderly. And I think most people would not find it disagreeable to say that there are plenty of professional contexts in which you shouldn't use expletives and that you should use more formal language. So language definitely does matter. And the psychological effects of it are also important, and there are more personal instances that make that salient. For example, if you have a friend or a member of your family or a colleague, or if we're working with a client, if we're a professional provider who has experienced trauma, and certain words or certain linguistic symbols remind them of the events in a way that affect their executive functioning, which is their brain's basic ability to communicate and process information, that then has a real effect on their functioning. Part of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed interaction means being considerate of that and trying to still communicate what you have to communicate, but in a way that avoids the impacts on their mental health. That is not just common courtesy, it's also a way to actually help somebody more effectively. Of course, if a client is working with me on trauma, which is one of my specializations, then the long-term goal is to help reduce the triggering effect so that they can face things in life that they may need to face without getting triggered. But that's a long-term goal that has some more complexity to it. But the language does matter in that sense, and especially with the certain historical value associated with certain words. The words themselves don't hold an inherent virtue. Calling someone a retard is just horrible, right? And in polite society, if you have any dignity, you would not call someone a retard. The word retard itself in French means late, and in English, in the current vernacular, it means to slow. So fire retardant, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So the use of the word was used to refer to somebody who had a delay in their intellectual development. But because it had so much stigma, it reached a point where it just wouldn't be practical at a societal level to try to destigmatize that word. So the best we can do is now use different language and then deliberately not put the stigma on it so that we can use a language effectively. I've seen just too many instances of people using all the correct language, all the correct buzzwords, and I'm sure you have as well, but it's clear from their behaviors that they don't really care. And what we need to do for the sake of clarity is start prioritizing actions over gestures. So if we keep allowing stigma to attach to language, what's going to happen is eventually we're going to have no language left to actually communicate concisely. So what we have to do is now as a society decide to make a conscientious effort.
We've covered a lot here, and some of your audience may be saying, okay, this is all stuff I've heard before. And some of your audience may be saying, wow, this is so much to unpack. Again, I particularly want to speak to the latter and say, I actually have compassion for what you're experiencing because this is so new and not adequately discussed on the right level societally. So one step at a time, one change at a time, one purposeful move at a time is all it takes.
Those are wise words, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
My pleasure. And to our audience, thank you to everyone for joining us today. A reminder that if you have any concerns about yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. Never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. And if you have any questions about what you've heard on the program today or elsewhere, please feel free to contact us. We are always open to feedback and to hearing different experiences and to conversing with people. And as Dan was saying in his final comments, I very much encourage you, if you're curious about a topic, try to find someone who not only has more experience than you, but also has a completely different perspective and learn to question them with empathy and curiosity, because that's the best way to learn about something, is to really be involved in it in the flesh. So thank you for joining us, and until next time, take care.